Hello. This is Morel Benard with the continuation of the story, David Copperfield. And the last word said that if I had any doubt of him, I suppose has half awakened it. But I'm inclined to believe that with the simple confidence of a child and the natural reliance of a child upon superior years, qualities I'm very sorry any children should prematurely change for worldly wisdom, I had no serious mistrust of him on the whole, even then. So, and please subscribe to the channel Study Coach UK. Please subscribe to Study Coach UK and please share. So, I will now continue with the story of David Copperfield. I felt it rather hard, I must own, to be made without deserving it the subject of jokes between the coachman and guard as to the coach drawing heavy behind on account of my sitting there, and as to the greater expediency of my travelling by wagon. The story of my supposed appetite getting wind among the outside passengers, they were merry upon it likewise, and asked me whether I was going to be paid for at school as 2 brothers or 3, and whether I was contracted for or went upon the regular terms, with other pleasant questions. But the worst of it was that I knew I should be ashamed to eat anything when an opportunity offered, and that after a rather light dinner, I should remain hungry all night, for I had left my cakes behind at the hotel in my hurry. My apprehensions were realized when we stopped for supper. I couldn't muster courage to take any, though I should have liked it very much, but sat by the fire and said I didn't want anything. This did not save me from more jokes either, for a husky-voiced gentleman with a rough face who had been eating out of a sandwich box nearly all the way, except when he was drinking out of a bottle, said I was like a boa constrictor who took enough at one meal to last him a long time, after which he actually brought a rash out upon himself with boiled beef. We had started from Yarmouth at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and we were due in London about 8 next morning. It was midsummer weather, and the evening was very pleasant. When we passed through a village, I pictured to myself what the insides of the houses were like, and what the inhabitants were about. And when boys came running after us and got up behind and swung there for a little while, I wondered whether their fathers were alive, and whether they were happy at home. I had plenty to think of, therefore, besides my mind running continually on the kind of place I was going to, which was an awful speculation. Sometimes I remember I resigned myself to thoughts of home and Peggoty, and to endeavouring in a confused, blind way to recall how I had left, and what sort of boy I used to be, before I bit Mr. Murdstone, which I couldn't satisfy myself about by any means. I seemed to have bitten him in such a remote antiquity. The night was not so pleasant as the evening, for it got chilly, and being put between 2 gentlemen, the rough-faced one and another, to prevent my tumbling off the coach, I was nearly smothered by their falling asleep and completely blocking me up. They squeezed me so hard sometimes that I could not help crying out, "Oh, if you please," which they didn't like at all, because it woke them. Opposite me was an elderly lady in a grey fur cloak, who looked in the dark more like a haystack than a lady. She was wrapped up to such a degree. This lady had a basket with her, and she hadn't known what to do with it for a long time, until she found that on account of my legs being short, it should go underneath me. It cramped and hurt me so that it made me perfectly miserable. But if I moved in the least and made a glass that was in the basket rattle against something else, as it was sure to do, she gave me the cruellest poke with her foot and said, "Come, you don't fidget. Your bones are young enough, I'm sure." At last, the sun rose, and then my companion seemed to sleep easier. The difficulties under which they had laboured all night, and which had found utterance in the most terrific gasps and snorts, are not to be conceived. As the sun got higher, their sleep became lighter, and so they gradually, one by one, awoke. I recollect being very much surprised by the feint everybody made, and then of not having been to sleep at all, and by the uncommon indignation with which everyone repelled the charge. I labour upon the same kind of astonishment to this day, having invariably observed that of all human weaknesses, the one to which our common nature is the least disposed to confess, I cannot imagine why, is the weakness of having gone to sleep in a coach. What an amazing place London was to me when I saw it in the distance, and how I believed all the adventures of my favourite heroes to be constantly enacting and re-enacting there, and how I vaguely made it out in my own mind to be fuller of wonders and wickedness than all the cities of the earth. I need not stop here to relate. We approached it by degrees, and got in due time to the inn in the Whitechapel district, for which we were bound. I forget whether it was the Blue Bull or the Blue Boar, but I know it was the Blue something, and that its likeness was painted up on the back of the coach. The guard's eye lighted on me as we was getting down, and he said at the booking office door, "Is there anybody here for a youngster booked in the name of Murdstone, from Blunderstone, Suffolk, to be left till called for?" Nobody answered. "Try Copperfield, if you please, sir," said I, looking helplessly down. "Is there anybody here for a youngster booked in the name of Murdstone, from Blunderstone, Suffolk, but owning to the name of Copperfield, to be left till called for?" said the guard. "Come, is there anybody?" No, there was nobody. I looked anxiously around, but the inquiry made no impression on any of the bystanders. If I except a man in gaiters with one eye, who suggested that they had better put a brass collar round my neck and tie me up in the stable. A ladder was brought, and I got down after the lady, who was like a haystack, not daring to stir until her basket was removed. The coach was clear of passengers by that time. The luggage was very soon cleared out. The horses had been taken out before the luggage, and now the coach itself was wheeled and backed off by some holsters, out of the way. Still, nobody appeared to claim the dusty youngster from Blunderstone, Suffolk. More solitary than Robinson Crusoe, who had nobody to look at him and see that he was solitary. I went into the booking office, and by invitation of the clerk on duty, passed behind the counter and sat down on the scale at which they weighed the luggage. Here, as I sat looking at the parcels, packages and books, and inhaling the smell of the stables, ever since associated with that morning, a procession of most tremendous considerations began to march through my mind. Supposing nobody should ever fetch me, how long would they consent to keep me there? Would they keep me long enough to spend 7 shillings? Should I sleep at night in one of those wooden bins with the other luggage and wash myself at the pump in the yard in the morning? Or should I be turned out every night and expected to come again to be left till called for when the office opened next day? Supposing there was no mistake in the case and Mr. Murdstone had devised this plan to get rid of me, what should I do? If they allowed me to remain there until my 7 shillings were spent, I couldn't hope to remain there when I began to starve. That would obviously be inconvenient and unpleasant to the customers, besides entailing on the blue whatever it was, the risk of funeral expenses. If I started off at once and tried to walk back home, how could I ever find my way? How could I ever hope to walk so far? How could I make sure of anybody but Peggoty, even if I got back? If I found out the nearest proper authorities and offered myself to go for a soldier or a sailor, I was such a little fellow that it was most likely they wouldn't take me in. These thoughts and 100 other such thoughts turned me burning hot and made me giddy with apprehension and dismay. I was on the height of my fever when a man entered and whispered to the clerk, who presently slanted me off the scale and pushed me over to him as if I were weighed, bought, delivered, and paid for. As I went out of the office hand in hand with this new acquaintance, I stole a look at him. He was a gaunt, sallow young man with hollow cheeks and a chin almost as black as Mr. Murdstone's, but there the likeness ended, for his whiskers were shaved off, and his hair, instead of being glossy, was rusty and dry. He was dressed in a suit of black clothes, which were rather rusty and dry too, and rather short in the sleeves and legs, and he had a white neck kerchief on that was not over clean. I did not and do not suppose that this neck kerchief was all the linen he wore, but it was all he showed or gave any hint of. "You're the new boy," he said. "Yes, sir," I said. "I suppose I was. I didn't know." "I'm one of the masters at Salem House," he said. I made him a bow and felt very much overawed. I was so ashamed to allude to a commonplace thing like my box to a scholar and a master at Salem House that we had gone some little distance from the yard before I had the hardihood to mention it. We turned back on my humbly insinuating that it might be useful to me hereafter, and he told the clerk that the carrier had instructions to call for it at noon. "If you please, sir," I said, when we had accomplished about the same distance as before. "Is it far?" "It's down by Blackheath," he said. "Is that far, sir?" I diffidently asked. "It's a good step," he said. "We should go by the stagecoach It's about 6 miles. I was so faint and tired that the idea of holding out for 6 miles more was too much for me. I took heart to tell him that I had had nothing all night, and that if he would allow me to buy something to eat, I should be very much obliged to him. He appeared surprised at this. I see him stop and look at me now, and after considering it for a while, said he wanted to call on an old person who lived not far off, and that the best way would be for me to buy some bread or whatever I liked best that was wholesome, and made my breakfast at her house, where we could get some milk. Accordingly, we looked in at a baker's window, and after I had made a series of proposals to buy everything that was bilious in the shop, and he had rejected them one by one, we decided in favour of a nice little loaf of brown bread, which cost me threepence. Then, at a grocer's shop, we bought an egg and a slice of streaky bacon, which still left what I thought a good deal of change out of the second of the bright shillings, and made me consider London a very cheap place. These provisions laid in, we went on through a great noise and uproar that confused my weary head beyond description, and over a bridge which no doubt was London Bridge. Indeed, I think he told me so, but I was half asleep. Until we came to the poor person's house, which was a part of some alms houses, as I knew by their look, and by an inscription on a stone over the gate which said they were established for 25 poor women. The master at Salem House lifted the latch of one of a number of little black doors that were all alike, and had each a little diamond-paned window on one side, and another little diamond-paned window above, and we went into the little house of one of these poor old women, who was blowing a fire to make a little saucepan boil. On seeing the master enter, the old woman stopped with the bellows on her knee, and said something that I thought sounded like Mr. Charlie. But on seeing me come in too, she got up, and rubbing her hands, made a confused sort of half curtsy. "Can you cook this young gentleman's breakfast for him, if you please?" said the master at Salem House. "Can I?" said the old woman. "Yes, can I, sure." "How's Mrs. Fitzbitson today?" said the master, looking at another old woman in a large chair by the fire, who was such a bundle of clothes that I feel grateful to this hour for not having sat upon her by mistake. "Ah, she's poorly," said the first old woman. "It's one of her bad days. If the fire was to go out through any accident, I verily believe she'd go out too, and never come to life again." As they looked at her, I looked at her also. Although it was a warm day, she seemed to think of nothing but the fire. I fancied she was jealous even of the saucepan on it, and I had reason to know that she took its impressment into the service of boiling my egg and broiling my bacon in dudgeon, for I saw her, with my own discomfited eyes, shake her fist at me once, when those culinary operations were going on, and no one else was looking. The sun streamed in at the little window, but she sat with her own back and the back of the large chair towards it, screening the fire as if she were sedulously keeping it warm, instead of it keeping her warm, and watching it in a most distrustful manner. The completion of the preparations for my breakfast by relieving the fire gave her such extreme joy that she laughed aloud, and a very melodious laugh she had, I must say. I sat down to my brown loaf, my egg, and my rasher of bacon, with a basin of milk besides, and made a most delicious meal. While I was yet in the full enjoyment of it, the old woman of the house said to the master, "Have you got your flute with you?" "Yes," he returned. "Have a blow at it," said the old woman, coaxingly. "Do." The master upon this put his hand underneath the skirts of his coat and brought out his flute in 3 pieces, which he screwed together, and began immediately to play. My impression is, after many years of consideration, that there never can have been anybody in the world who played worse. He made the most dismal sounds I have ever heard produced by any means, natural or artificial. I don't know what the tunes were, if there were such things in the performance at all, which I doubt. But the influence of the strain upon me was first to make me think of all my sorrows until I could hardly keep my tears back, then to take away my appetite, and lastly to make me so sleepy that I couldn't keep my eyes open. They begin to close again, and I begin to nod, as the recollection rises fresh upon me. Once more, the little room with its open corner cupboard, and its square back chairs, and its angular little staircase lead into the room above, and its 3 peacock's feathers displayed over the mantelpiece. I remember wondering when I first went in, what that peacock would have thought if he had known what his finery was doomed to come to. Fades from before me, and I nod and sleep. The flute becomes inaudible. The wheels of the coach are heard instead, and I am on my journey. The coach jolts. I wake with a start, and the flute has come back again, and the master at Salem House is sitting with his legs crossed, playing it dolefully, while the old woman of the house looks on delighted. She fades in her turn, and he fades, and they all fades, and there is no flute, no master, no Salem House, no David Copperfield, no anything but heavy sleep. I dreamed, I thought, that once while he was blowing into this dismal flute, the old woman of the house, who had gone nearer and nearer to him in her ecstatic admiration, leaned over the back of his chair and gave him an affectionate squeeze round the neck, which stopped his playing for a moment. I was in the middle state between sleeping and waking, either then or immediately afterwards. For as he resumed, it was a real fact that he had stopped playing. I saw and heard the same old woman ask Mrs. Fitzson if it wasn't delicious, meaning the flute, to which Mrs. Fibbitson replied, "Aye, aye, yes," and nodded at the fire, to which I am persuaded she gave the credit of the whole performance. When I seemed to have been dozing a long while, the master at Salem House unscrewed his flute into the 3 pieces, put them up as before, and took me away. We found the coach very near at hand, and got upon the roof. But I was so dead sleepy that when we stopped on the road to take up somebody else, they put me inside, where there were no passengers, and where I slept profoundly until I found the coach going at a foot pace up a steep hill among green leaves. Presently it stopped and had come to its destination. A short walk brought us, the master and me, to Salem House, which was enclosed with a high brick wall and looked very dull. Over a door in this wall was a board with Salem House upon it, and through a grating in this door we were surveyed when we rang the bell by a surly face, which I found on the door being opened belonged to a stout man with a bull neck, a wooden leg, overhanging temples, and his hair cut close all round his head. "The new boy," said the master. The man with the wooden leg eyed me all over. It didn't take long, for there was not much of me, and locked the gate behind us, and took out the key. We were going up to the house, among some dark, heavy trees, when he called after my conductor, "Hello." We looked back, and he was standing at the door of a little lodge where he lived, with a pair of boots in his hand. "Here, the cobbler's been," he said, "since you've been out, Mr. Mel, and he says he can't mend 'em any more. He says there ain't a bit of the original boot left, and he wonders you expect it." With these words, he threw the boots towards Mr. Mel, who went back a few paces to pick them up and looked at them very disconsolately. I was afraid as we went on together. I observed then, for the first time, that the boots he had on were a good deal the worse for wear, and that his stocking was just breaking out in one place, like a bud. Salem House was a square brick building with wings of a bare and unfurnished appearance. All about it was so very quiet that I said to Mr. Bell, "I suppose the boys were out." But he seemed surprised at my not knowing that it was holiday time, that all the boys were at their several homes, that Mr. Creakle, the proprietor, was down by the seaside with Mrs. and Mrs. Creakle, and that I was sent in holiday time as a punishment for my misdoing. All of which he explained to me as we went along. Join me. Join me for the next episode, the next video. Join me for the next video of David Copperfield. Look forward to seeing you then. Bye.